This episode is going to focus on the anatomy of the skull. We are going to be looking at the proportions, the individual bones, and then a way to construct and draw the skull on any angle. So I'm going to start by drawing a front and side view and discussing some average proportions. There's many methods to do this, but here are some general guidelines that I consider when it comes to placing the features and constructing the skull. The skull can be divided into 3 equal sections. There's also about a quarter of one of these sections extra at the top. This establishes the height and I create a centre line. The skull is around 2 sections wide. Now I divide these sections on the centre line to find a rough placement for the features. This second line down will be the top of the eye sockets, a half the line at that section and a half it again above to find the point of the nasal bone and the glabella, which is the section of bone between the eyes. From that halfway point I draw the nose aperture down to the next line. When I draw in the eye sockets they will come to around the halfway point of this section. Now I start to draw in the zygomatic bone. We cover the names of the bones later in this episode, but this part of the skull comes from around the eye sockets and extrudes out a little at either side before then curving down towards the maxilla. To find the distance of the maxilla, I divide the bottom section into quarters and use this first point. The mandible, which is the jawbone, will come down from below the zygomatic bone to the bottom line. I then finish this front view by drawing in the cranium of the skull, using these divisions as a guide. So that is a front view of the skull, and I'm going to project the same lines across to draw the side view. These same divisions are applied, except the skull from a side is around 3 sections wide. I add half a section to either side of this because I can use these lines to locate some of the features. Now from a side view you can get a better idea of the form of the skull. The nasal bone extrudes out a little bit and the aperture of the nose curves inwards and outwards to the maxilla, which also has a curve to it. The eye sockets push into the skull and that zygomatic bone comes around the side. This section of the bone will end just short of that halfway point along with the mandible. I draw in the cranium of the skull using the guidelines and you can see how much wider the skull is on a side compared to the front. That is a way to divide the skull up into sections, and from doing this you can check the proportions. Be sure to study this and try to recognise other relationships between bones and their distances. If you can familiarise yourself with this, you'll become more confident in judging the placement of features and will rely less on construction lines. In this part we are going to take a look at the skull from a 3/4 view in perspective. Here I'm creating the same dividing lines which we saw in the last example, except this time these would be converging towards a vanishing point in perspective. The same method can be applied though. I find a centre line and then I find the first section. Now there's going to be a bit of foreshortening here, so to duplicate this section accurately, I bring a line from the bottom corner through the halfway point. Where this line meets the other is where I draw that next section. So now we have this grid in perspective and I make the same divisions. I'm going to construct this the same way as last time, but I have to consider the overall perspective, making sure the features on the frontal plane follow the same convergence. There is also the side plane, and the features here would converge to the other vanishing point. I usually decide that the transition between the front plane and the side plane is where the zygomatic bones start to curve around the side. I also use that part of the bone to establish the location of the other vanishing point. On this example, it's going to be in line with the bottom of the eye sockets though, because the horizon line is placed across the centre of the skull here. Later in this episode we cover a more simplified approach for drawing the skull on any angle, but before we get to that, it's good to have an understanding of how perspective plays a part in anything we draw. We also need to be familiar with the bones which make up the skull and their forms, so let's use this drawing to have a look at that. Firstly, we have the frontal bone which forms the top of the eye sockets. Then we have the nasal bone, and this varies in size and shape in different people. It forms the bridge of the nose. Below that we have the maxilla. On each side of that we have the zygomatic bones, which is the cheekbone. Behind that there is the sphenoid bone, and this sits in the middle of the skull towards the front. So next on either side there is the temporal bone, and this connects with the zygomatic bone and some others, but we'll take a look at that later. You can't see the left temporal bone here, but there is two of them, and it's the same situation with the parietal bone. This is around the side and top of the cranium. Lower down from that at the very back there is the occipital bone, but you can't really see it from this angle. Finally, down at the bottom we have the mandible, which is the jawbone, and this comes up and joins the rest of the skull behind that zygomatic bone. So these are the bones that we want to focus on. There are others, but a lot of them exist inside of the skull, so we don't really have to pay much attention to them. It's useful to know how these bones connect and relate to each other. It's pretty much like a jigsaw, you can take it apart and then piece it back together. So now let's take a look at all of these bones which make up the skull in isolation. It might help to understand the form of them if it's broken down like this. I'll rotate some of these round on a few angles. Also, I've included the front and side view on screen and highlighted the bones being drawn so that you can see the position of them. One thing to note is that some of these can be quite complex. Remember that we don't see every side of these, and so we really just want to pay attention to how they appear on the surface of the skull. So that is all of the bones of the skull laid out separately, at least the ones that we want to study. Now that we are familiar with the individual bones and their forms, let's take a look at how to actually construct and draw the skull. The proportions were covered at the start, and so now I'm going to work through a simple method for constructing and drawing the skull on any angle. I begin with a sphere which represents the cranial mass. The next step is to begin working out the angle of the skull. For this example, I'm drawing a 3/4 view. I add a dividing line which wraps around the form of the sphere. This line will indicate the top of the eye sockets. I draw in a centre line keeping with the form of the sphere, and then I create a side plane. This will change depending on the angle you are drawing at, but now we have a form which is similar to the cranium of the skull. At this stage I start to divide this front plane into 3 equal sections. There's also the extra at the top, so now you can see how this relates back to the divisions we made earlier for the proportions at the start of the episode. To finish this off, I join that bottom section up with the side plane, and then it gives me a form which is similar to the skull. I also have the dividing lines which assist me in placing the features. I'm going to leave this like this and create some examples next to it. When I draw these skulls, you'll probably notice that I draw in the construction lines quite loosely, and through repeated practice you'll become more familiar with the form of the skull and will rely less on these lines. When drawing the skull this way, I normally use the part of the zygomatic bone around the outer edge of the eye sockets as a way to recognise the transition from the front plane to the side plane. I sometimes start drawing in the skull from this point as well. Try and study these examples and practice rotating this simple form on various angles before drawing in the skull. So that is a simple way to construct and draw the skull on any angle. To conclude this episode, I'm going to show another example of this. Here I'm going to rotate the skull in different directions. Starting with the front view, notice how the side plane changes as the skull rotates. I'm drawing each one of these at the same size, and so I'm using the front view as a reference to judge the placement of the features along with the construction lines. From studying the skull and familiarising myself with the bones and their forms, I was able to visualise how it would appear on different angles. So this episode is about to come to an end, and I hope you found this useful. The form of the skull is what shapes the face, and as we progress through this series we will see how important it is. In the next one we are going to be looking at the spine. Anatomy starts with the bones, and so the skeleton will be covered in full before moving on to the muscles. Be sure to subscribe with the notifications on to stay up to date, and if you did find this useful then please give the video a like. But that's it for this one, so thank you for watching.